Okay, turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 13. So the handout that I gave you is on Paul's journeys, and it just sort of looks at his life and all of it, breaks it down into the different parts when he was a Pharisee, and then his salvation and so forth, and all the way to the end of his life on the other side. It's a chart I did, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago as I was studying the book of Acts. I thought, because I'm a visual kind of person, I like to see things. But what it really covers is everything from chapter 13, well, actually from chapter 9 all the way to the end of the book of Acts and into Timothy and Titus. So I hope that you'll enjoy it as a good resource to have. Anyways, chapter 13 begins with the expansion of the church, right, through the various missionary journeys that are mentioned there. If you remember, the church began in Jerusalem. It moved out into Judea and Samaria through various mission efforts, as well as the persecution of Saul himself, and they were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And then the king it settled there in Antioch, and Antioch was in that area. It was the third largest city in the whole Roman Empire, and it was right there in that area, and it had this large, growing, multi-ethnic church, which is now preparing to send missionaries out. I was just thinking as we were discussing that there's nothing historically to say where they met, but scholars all agree that the church was very large, and so there were you could almost think it was a mega church, the way the commentaries talk about it. So they would have had to meet in some kind of a hall or large public place. Anyways, it's hard to know what they did at that time. So then they're sending out the missionaries. Now I want to begin by asking you a question, and at first it's going to sound like a dumb question because the answer will be obvious for most of us. And the question is this: how many missionary journeys are there in the book of Acts? How many missionary journeys are in the book of Acts? Now, because I said it seems obvious, you know that it's not going to be free.
You said 4 on here.
Right. Okay. Chapters 13 to 21 are all about the missionary endeavors of the church. Okay, but everybody will bring, even the outline that I gave you on the book of Acts, it divides it up and it tells you that there was a first journey that started in chapter 13. There was a second journey that started later, and there was the end of chapter 15, and a third journey that started, I can't remember what chapter now, I think maybe it was 18 or something like that. Okay, 3 journeys. I bet you if you flip to the back of your Bible, if you have maps in your Bible, that the very last map is probably a map titled Paul's Missionary Journeys. Am I right? It's close, okay? Right? And in the legend it probably says first journey, second journey, third journey, and it's got it all color coded so you can see where they went. Okay? And then it'll also have Paul's trip to Rome while he was a prisoner. Okay? Okay? Some people actually will say that the trip to Rome was a missionary journey, but in its real right, it's not. It's not a missionary journey, although Paul, of course, never stops preaching the gospel wherever he went. But it wasn't really a planned journey. He had no idea when they were going to take him. In fact, it took them almost 3 years to even get on the way from when he was first in prison. So, and even the handout I gave you, if you look at it, part 2 says Paul's first missionary journey. And part 4 says Paul's second missionary journey. And part 5, Declan, what does part 5 say? Paul's third missionary journey, you see. Okay? And again, as we've already mentioned, if you look at even at part 7 on there, it says Paul's fourth missionary journey. And that's not, the fourth journey is not recorded in the book of Acts, but we do get it from Timothy and Titus. It tells us. So we know that he was imprisoned in Rome at the end of Acts in 62. He was in prison for 2 years, so he was obviously released. And then he did the journey that Timothy and Titus tell us about. Then he ended back in Rome and imprisoned again in 66, and he was martyred in 66 or 67. So that's the life of Paul. So the question is, are these 3 journeys the only journeys that are in the book of Acts? And your answer is going to be what?
No, probably not.
Probably not, because I wouldn't have been leaving it up this way if it was, right? In fact, I would say to you that I think that there are indications that there are a number of other missionary journeys happening at the same time that we can actually identify in the book of Acts, and a bunch others that are implied, but we can't really identify. And I think that the missing this fact, that there are more than the 3 journeys, causes us to misunderstand the purpose of Paul's missionary journeys. We look at it totally differently. It helps us to hone in on its purpose, and that's what I want to do this morning. So we're going to take a kind of a look at the strategy and an overview of what Paul and Barnabas had planned, what God instructed them, that they went to Jerusalem about, met with Peter and the apostles, and got approval of, and then came back, and then they were sent out to implement it. So we won't look at all of these verses, but you might want to, as I mentioned them, just kind of flip there yourselves just so you can see them. But let's start in Acts chapter 15, verse 39. In Acts 15:39. This is the start of Paul's second missionary journey. After the first, they had the Jerusalem Council, and then the Jerusalem Council, they returned back to Antioch, and then in 39, Paul and Barnabas were going to go out again. In fact, I think it was Barnabas that suggested that they do it, and Barnabas said, "Let's get Mark and go again." And Paul said, "No, I don't want to take Mark because he kind of disappointed me last time." We don't know what the disappointment was, but Paul didn't want to take him, so Barnabas said, "Okay, I'll take Mark, you take Silas." And look at what it says in verse 39. "And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him." And where does it say he went?
Cyprus.
He went to Cyprus. This is a missionary journey that Paul and Silas did. Now, the book of Acts doesn't give us any more information about Barnabas and Mark, rather. Barnabas and Mark, and what they did, where they went after Cyprus. Now, we know that Cyprus was where Barnabas grew up. We know that Mark is his cousin, so maybe he lived there as well. We know that when Paul and Barnabas went out on the first journey, the first place they went to was Cyprus, and they established a church there. And so, but Barnabas and Mark, we know that his idea is to go to the churches and go back out on doing another missionary tour. So Barnabas and Mark went on a tour. Okay, and verse 40, Paul and Silas, they departed on a tour as well, but what does verse 41 say? They went through where? Syria and Cilicia. Okay, so if you, I don't know if you have your map or not, but if you look at it, Antioch is sitting here. If you go, you have to take a boat to Cyprus, to the island, which is where Barnabas and Mark went, but then Paul and Silas went from Antioch north. And Syria and Cilicia are the provinces. In fact, Antioch is in Syria. So they went north, and they're heading out. So there we know of at least one other missionary tour by Barnabas and Mark. So now flip over to chapter 18. In chapter 18, again on Paul's second missionary journey, He had gone all the way up through Macedonia, and he had come down to Corinth. And when he came into Corinth, he met a couple by the name of Aquila and Priscilla. Now, Aquila and Priscilla were Jews that lived in Rome, and the Emperor Claudius, we had talked about him a few weeks ago, Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. And the interesting thing is, he didn't really kick out the Christians, at least the Gentile Christians, as far as historians are aware, only the Jews. But Priscilla and Aquila, being Jewish, even though they were believers, they were part of that being kicked out of Rome. Well, they went to Corinth, and they reestablished their trade there. It tells us that they were tent makers, and Paul was a tent maker. Do you remember that? And usually what happened in the first century time, the Jewish scribe or a rabbi, they weren't allowed to get paid. Don't know why it was that situation, but they weren't allowed to get paid, so they needed to have some kind of a trade. And so it's assumed that not Priscilla, but Aquila, who's the man in the relationship, that he was probably had this trade, and more likely a Jewish scribe or rabbi that became a believer. They've reestablished there in Corinth. And then it's possible, when we think of it all, it's very possible, although we can't really prove it, but again, the scriptures always tie things together, and you can put this together, that if you look back at Acts chapter 2, verse 10, when it is identifying all of the nationalities that came to the feast at Pentecost, on the day of Pentecost, one of them says they came even as far as Rome, in verse 10. So it's possible, I mean, you have to think to yourself, how could Aquila and Priscilla become believers when they lived in Rome? Well, maybe they were part of the 3,000 that were saved on the day of Pentecost, who had traveled to Jerusalem from Rome, met God, and were saved, and then went home back to Rome. And they were probably, because when Paul finally got to Rome, there was already a church there. So who would have started the church in Rome? It would have been either the Jews that were scattered because of the persecution of Saul, or it would have been the Jews that were saved on the day of Pentecost, like Aquila and Priscilla. So they were missionaries in their own right already in their own hometown. But they being kicked out, were now in Corinth, when Paul arrives in Corinth, and he sees them, and they join Paul's ministry for a very short time. When Paul left Corinth, they left with them and went to Ephesus. And when they came into Ephesus, then Paul left Ephesus and went back to Antioch, which is the end of the second missionary journey. But Priscilla and Aquila stayed in Ephesus. All right? And the next time that Paul comes to Ephesus, guess what? There's a thriving church in Ephesus. Well, who did it? So now we're going to see another connection here with Priscilla and Aquila that will help us to understand that they were also missionaries doing missionary work. And we see this in Acts 18, verse 27. Okay, you're there, right? Okay, in verse 24, it tells us that a man by the name of Apollos, Apollos, and this is another missionary. It says that he was a native of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is in Africa, in northern Africa, Egypt area. Okay? So he's a native from way down there, but he has come to Ephesus. Right? And he's eloquent in the scriptures. What does it tell us he do? He went into the synagogue, verse 26, and he boldly spoke. Now that's exactly what we're going to see that Paul did when he went on his journey. He went to the synagogue, preached the gospel, and people were saved. Apollos from Africa arrives in Ephesus, he goes into the synagogue, and people are saved. But he meets Priscilla and Aquila there. They're there because they want to hear him preach. Now, they discovered that Apollos had a little bit problem with some of his theology, and they straightened him out. But having straightened him out, then what did they do? Verse 28, he powerfully speaking of Apollos, he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. Then 19:1, and it happened that while Apollos was now at Corinth. How did he get to Corinth? It's because Priscilla and Aquila sent him on his way. He continued on his missionary journey. So now we have Barnabas and Mark. We follow them only to Cyprus, but we have Priscilla and Aquila who are in Corinth and then in Ephesus. And then we have Apollos who comes from Alexandria to Ephesus, but now he is sent on to Corinth. So he is conducting a missionary tour as well. Meanwhile, Paul starts his third journey, and he arrives in Ephesus just after Apollos had left. And of course, he finds some disciples there that were disciples of John the Baptist, and he helps them to get things right. And in chapter 19, he goes to the synagogue. This is probably the same synagogue that Apollos was in. But the Jews that are left there now, they kind of don't like him. So Paul says, okay, I'll wash my hands of you. And then, what does it say? He went to the hall of Tyrannus and to preach. So he went directly to the Gentiles, to the Greeks, and he's preaching. But if you just flip back now to Acts 16 for a second. So we have Barnabas and Mark, Priscilla and Aquila, and Apollos. In Acts 16 verse 6, when Paul was on his second missionary journey, it tells us that he started out by revisiting the churches that he established on his first journey, and then he wanted to go to Ephesus, into Asia, to preach the gospel there. But the Spirit of God prevented him, forbid him, in fact, it says, it forbid him from going into Asia. So he had to go up north and around the top, and there where he received the vision of the man in Macedonia calling for him to come, and he went there and he established the Macedonian churches. Right? So that brings us back to chapter 19, where Paul spent, it tells us in chapter 19 that he spent 2 years now in Ephesus, but he gets there, there's already believers there, probably through the ministry of Priscilla and Aquila, and definitely through Apollos. He gets there and he spends 2 years there in the hall of Tyrannus. Now the interesting verse there is verse 10 of chapter 19. It says, he continued there for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word. Now, Paul has never been in Asia yet, other than this lower part between Iconium and Ephesus. He's never been up in Asia. You know, the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3 were written to the 7 churches. Okay? These are the 7 churches in Asia. But Paul's not been there. But here it says, Paul is in Ephesus, and all the residents of Asia heard the word. Now, in chapter 19, later on, in verse 24, a man named Demetrius, who was a silversmith, he was mad at Paul because he was losing business, because his business was to make the idols. But because people were becoming believers, they weren't buying the idols anymore. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And he blames Paul. He says, verse 26, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but almost all of Asia, this Paul is persuaded. So he's implying that Paul went into Asia and to give the gospel, and people were saved. But in fact, as the historians look at this and other documents, and as they try to examine this, most scholars would say that it wasn't Paul directly, but Paul indirectly. Because 19:10 is telling us that he stayed there and he kept teaching in the hall of Tyrannus, and some of the people from Asia were coming there, but mostly it was the people that were being saved in Ephesus going out into Asia and establishing the churches. So there's the next missionary tour. It is people from the church in Ephesus going into Asia to plant churches. Right? And of course at least 7 because of the 7 letters in Revelation. So you have Barnabas and Mark, Priscilla and Aquila, Apollos, and then the mission in Asia is being established. So these are different missionary tours that are happening at the same time. Now remember I told you that Paul had a strategy for doing missions, taking the gospel to the Gentiles? It would seem that his strategy was to take the gospel to an unchurched area in order to establish a church who would take the gospel to an unchurched area in order to establish a church, who would take the gospel to an unchurched area in order to establish a church. You get the idea here. Unfortunately, modern missions, particularly through the 1900s, got so that they would send missionaries to foreign fields, to unchurched areas, but they did not establish churches. And what happened was these missionaries had to stay there for years and years and years and years. And they've discovered in recent times, Paul Washer's mission organization passes my thoughts right now. His mission organization, Gospel for Asia, that's another one, and even the mission organization that the Caritas and the Klakengas in Cat Lake are part of. Their goal is they go to establish churches, so then the missionaries leave, and those churches reach out to their community. And as they reach out to their community, they will establish new churches who reach out and so forth. That's the new model that seems to be working the most. But that's what Paul and Barnabas did. Okay? In fact, another way of saying this would be that preach the gospel, gather converts into a local church, and then send them out. Or gospel, gather, go. There's how we do missions. Okay? But missions is the church doing it. It's not the church sending across the ocean. Now there are places for that, right? But we have really lost it. So this is why we have people always saying, you got to come back and reach out to your own Jerusalem and your Judea and Samaria, and don't forget the rest of the world. But it's a wrong mindset. Missions is one thing. It's reaching out. The first missionary journey was how many people? 2. Paul and Barnabas, right? 2 men. They go out to the island of Cyprus. They go into 3 cities. If you look at your outline there on the first missionary journey, you'll see it. They go into 3 cities after the island of Cyprus and establish 3 churches: Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. That's all they did on their first missionary journey. He went to Iconium, preached in the synagogue, people were saved. The Jews got mad, he went to Lystra, went to the synagogue, people were saved. The Jews from Iconium came down there to spread their anger some more. He goes into Derbe, goes to the synagogue, preaches the gospel, people are saved. He establishes the church in Derbe, backtracks. Now he goes to Lystra, double checks on the church there, finds out they're doing good, backtracks, goes to Iconium, double checks on the church there, and then goes home. That's the first missionary journey. What was his goal? His goal was to establish churches who would then go into the other area. And this is why when Paul starts going into Upper Galatia, he discovers there are people already saved up there. Why? Because the 3 churches went and preached the gospel, gathered them into local churches, who then preached the gospel in another area, gathered them into local churches. So you got to have the planting of the churches. That's what makes it spread from Jerusalem to the ends of the world. The second missionary journey, the first part of the second missionary journey, Paul starts out in Antioch, but instead of going to Cyprus, he goes up across the top and then goes to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. Make sure that the churches are doing okay. Why? To make sure that they're got the gospel right, that they're going into areas and gathering people and then sending out more people. That's what he was doing. And then, of course, Paul then goes up into Macedonia. He wanted to go to Asia, but he goes up into Macedonia. What does he do? He now has Timothy with him. So it's not just it's Paul and Silas, right? They also pick up Timothy along the way, and Luke joins them. So there's the 4 men who go in and they establish Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and Corinth. Churches in 5 cities. Then he comes back home. So now we've got 3 cities here, we've got 5 cities up here. In the next time that he goes out on the 3rd journey, exclusively all he's doing is visiting the churches that he established, and we discover, as you follow through it, he went to other cities that he hadn't gone before, where there are established churches. Who established those churches? The other churches that he established, you see. These churches, what they did was they took the gospel to the unchurched areas and established local churches. So, went backwards. There we go. So we can have the church in there, and then it looks like this. Okay. What would be the next picture if we kept on going?
Another Bible in a church and a Bible.
That's right, a Bible in a church and a Bible in a church. And it's almost like a multi-level marketing scheme where you start with one person who hires 2 people, and those 2 hire 1 person or 2 people, and then all of a sudden you're recruiting, you got tons of people. This is what the church is to do. Paul established a church who went out into different areas, established 4 churches. Those 4 churches went out, and now you got 16 churches, and now then you got it just compound. What's this? Interest, right? That's what it's supposed to do. And then in our own church history, we kind of broke it down. And once the first world, the 2 world wars came, actually prior to that, the church just kind of lost its fizzle. And then after the world wars, they tried to relook at what is missions. And they got it all wrong because they weren't going back to the scriptures to find the pattern. Now we have to be careful that we don't say that we don't, the wording is not we do exactly what they did. Right? That's not the thing is that we use the strategy and adapt it to our own culture where we are. And the strategy is very simple. You go and establish a church, and then you give the gospel to you give the gospel to a community, establish the church, and then you send them out to further communities. And that's the pattern that it works on. So, it just quickly again, I've already talked about this, but to help us to see it again, Paul's strategy and actually when he was going out. So this is the preaching of the gospel with the Bible there. Look at it. It tells us that, well, look at 13 verse 5. Okay, chapter 13 verse 5. When they arrived at Salamis, which is on the island of Cyprus, so it's the very first place that they went on the very first missionary journey. It says they proclaimed the word of God in what?
The synagogues of the Jews.
In the synagogues. All right? And you're going to get this every place that he went to, pretty much, he went to the synagogues. Well, the first question that should come to your mind is, wait a minute, I thought Paul was commissioned to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Then why is he going to the synagogues? Isn't that a good question? I think it's a good question. All right, well, here's our answer. Let's see here, verse 16, chapter 13, verse 16. Okay. So they're in Pisidia, which is Antioch in Pisidia. And on the Sabbath day, he goes into the synagogue, sits down, verse 16. So Paul stands up in the synagogue, and motioning with his hands, he says, "Men of Israel." You see that? Who are the men of Israel?
Jews.
They're Jews. Paul. But is that all it says? It says, "Men of Israel and you who fear God." Who are the you who fear God? The you who fear God are the Gentiles. Look at verse 26 in another place. In another place he says, "Brothers, sons of the families of Abraham," Jew or Gentile?
Jews.
Jews. "And those among you who fear God." Jew or Gentile?
Gentiles.
Gentiles. Okay, you see that? Chapter 14, verse 1 makes it clearer. In Iconium, they entered together to the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. It's in the Jewish synagogue. Why did Paul go to the Jewish synagogue to reach the Gentiles?
Because there were Gentiles there that were seeking with God.
See, and here's the thing. You and I, what we do is we would say, hey, if God called me to go to the Gentiles, I'll just go right out there to the pagans and wherever they are and try to reach them. Paul says, no. God has already prepared the hearts of many of the Gentiles, and they're meeting with the Jews because they know that there's something about the Jewish God that'll give them the answers to what they're seeking. God has already prepared people. What is our goal? Our goal is not to save everybody. Our goal is to find the sheep. People that God is already preparing and working on. Okay? And these people are going to be drawn by God either through circumstances or something. Culturally there, Paul was able to find them in the synagogue. Now, does that mean that we go to the synagogue to establish church? No, because there's a synagogue here in the city of Belleville, but I don't think there's any Gentiles going there at all. I don't think so. Right? And I don't think that they would even allow us into the synagogue to preach the gospel like Paul had back then. We had a much greater freedom there. So it's not the precedence, but what is it telling us? It says, go where people are prepared. Now, why would he go? He also wanted to reach the Jews, but only the Jews who were called by God were saved. The other Jews caused them all the troubles, right? Okay? And then the Gentiles were saved. So God has prepared people. So the very first principle of missions is to, and it's the hard part is now figuring out how to make it work, but the very first principle is you got to go find the sheep, the ones that God is already preparing. So you have to think in terms of where would those people be, and what kind of information is it that will cause that God can use to actually save them. All right. So that was Paul's strategy. We can look at a number of other verses that all talk about the same thing. So he went to those who were near the truth. It's kind of the way one book put it. Paul gave priority to devout Gentiles whose hearts are already being prepared through their association with the Jews and the synagogue. He only went to the Hall of Tyrannus when the Jews kicked him out of the synagogue. He said, "You're no longer welcome here." That's the only time he went outside to preach to Gentiles. So you don't blanket areas. It's called selective evangelism, where you're selecting the group which has the greatest potential of response to the gospel, as well as the greatest potential for becoming effective evangelistic witness. All right. And of course, David Hasselgrave, he's the author of that book I told you yesterday, Tim, that you need to read. It's called Planting Churches Cross-Culturally. He says this: the primary mission of the church is to proclaim the gospel of Christ and gather believers in the local churches where they can be built up in the faith and made effective in service. Thus, new congregations are to be planted throughout the world. That's got to be the objective of missions. And he goes on and he talks about various parachurch organizations that do a lot of preaching the gospel, but they have no plan of what to do with anybody that's saved. And they can't bring them into a church because they themselves are not a church. And oftentimes these parachurch organizations going out there with the gospel have people from multiple churches. And so you can't say, well, anybody that's saved through our ministry, they're coming to my church. Because the other guy will say, no, I want them to come to my church. Okay? And it doesn't work. So what ends up happening is that these people are saved and they say, here, you need to go find a church. And they leave them on their own. And what that means for us as a church is that there are a lot of people out there who are probably still looking for a church. They don't really realize it. Most times they'll go to the churches closest to them or some kind of contact. Now those are the ones then that Paul would be reaching out. They're the ones that are near to the truth but haven't really been properly either discipled or saved at this point. They are still goats that have not become sheep, or sheep that have not been found. Sheep that are still lost. That's the way to say it. Okay? It only took 11 years. The 3 missionary journeys that Paul did only covers 11 years, and he went through 4 provinces of Rome: Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, and Asia. And he established all these churches. And from there, they went out into the whole world. And the reason it went to the world was because the goal was to establish churches. They present the gospel to establish a church. And establishing the church, they're able now to train them to go out to areas, establish new churches, and so forth. That's how, all the way through the first centuries, that the church grew and grew and grew. And part of the reason why today we see very little churches being built, we hear of lots of salvations, but there's really nothing to back it up, nothing that has brought these people. If you don't gather them together into a local church, then how do they know that they need to go out and go farther and establish other churches? They don't. And so it gets harder and harder. So it's clear then that the goal of ministry was to establish churches. And then, did Paul stay there, by the way? It says that he stayed for 2 years in Ephesus. He stayed a little over 2 years in Corinth. But then he left, right? He didn't go there to be their pastor, although what was he doing those 2 years? He was teaching them. But it tells us that he then established elders in the church, and then he left. Because his goal was not to be there. And this is one of the problems that we have with missions. A lot of the career missionaries, they can't leave their mission. They're stuck there. This is my mission. They don't leave. And they don't let the local church of the local nationals take over and be responsible for reaching their own people. I gotta stay there. They don't leave. Once a church is established, they should be leaving and going to another unchurched area. When we look at our world today, 20% of our world's population call themselves Christians who are not Christians, but they think they are. That's our mission field, particularly here in North America, because these are people that are in Christian churches, but are lost sheep and goats. Many of them, if not the majority, are Christian only by name. And they're a great potential for the church because in one sense they're relatively easy to reach. But the thing is, they're in churches where they're not hearing the gospel, so they're not being saved. They're in churches feeling comfortable. They're in churches for the culture. They're in churches for, hey, this church has really good coffee. Okay? I can go here Sunday mornings and I can get my coffee for free, and the people are really nice. I can send my kids out out of my hair, so I've got an hour or two where I'm free of the kids and I can relax, and we sing great music, got great bands. And that's what we've done. We've created a culture that makes the goat feel comfortable in church. So that becomes our greatest mission field, because these people, when they go back to their community, are really the unsaved, but the prepared. See what I'm saying? Yeah. Just like Paul going into the synagogue, those Gentiles there were unsaved, but prepared. So that's 20% of the world's population. And that's who we need to go to. And the other thing, of course, is to the pagans, to the ones that don't go to church, who have a worldview, a humanistic worldview, believe in evolution and all this kind of stuff. And we can't ignore them. as well. But you don't give them the same message as you give the others, either.
Same message in a different way.
It's the same, thank you, Bert. It's the same message, but presented in a different way. In chapter 13, we have quite a long sermon of Paul's message of the gospel, but it's to a Jewish audience. In chapter 17, we have another long message of the gospel, but now this is in Athens, and he's in the era, what is it called?
Acropolis.
Yes, that place. Okay, that's where he is, which is a place where philosophers would debate. Okay, but he's standing, he's giving the gospel, the same gospel he gave in the other, but when he was talking to the Jewish audience, he's going through the history of Israel to show how Christ is the fulfillment of the history. When he's there in Athens and he's talking to the Greeks, he's giving the same gospel because he ends up with Christ, but he's talking about God as the creator of the world. He says, you guys have all of these idols, and I'm going to tell you, these idols do nothing. They're nobodies. They're nothing. But I know the God who created everything. And he talked about God the creator and how as the creator, and then the sin coming in the world and the need for being brought into a right relationship with God, and that can only happen through Jesus Christ. So it's the same message. So this is what we got to do as a church. When we go into a community, wherever it is, we've got to get the gospel to the community. But there's two audiences. It's not a neither or, it's a both and. Okay? So we need to have that gospel presented in a way that deals with the barriers that these two groups have. So if you want to reach that, for instance, the Roman Catholics are a great audience because they're very near to the gospel, but they don't have the truth. In many ways, the cults are very near, but don't have the truth. And so it's just a matter of presenting the gospel to them within their situation. And then the pagans, of course, coming at it again by through their worldview. So we need to do that. And I've been searching and searching and searching for gospel tracts and different things. And even with Answers in Genesis, where I thought I really would find something, I don't find anything out there that really presents the gospel fully in a manner that specifically goes towards a specific group. Anybody that's like near to the gospel, or even a worldly. It's all apologetic and more polemic in its presentation. And that doesn't win people. That's just argumentative. It's soft arguing, but so we might have to write our own material to do that. But that's got to become our focus. So when we're sitting here in this house today, we're saying, hey, God, we want to be in an area that's unchurched. In Belleville, there's going to be church people in there, and this is why that whole area around Hillcrest really jumped out at us, because there was no church there. That we go in there, we can identify the boundaries of this whole area, and we know that in that area that there are a whole bunch of people who are near to the gospel but aren't saved yet. We also know that there's a bunch of pagans who need the basics of God the Creator. Okay? So we need to have something that introduces ourselves, that meets them right where they are, but gives them the gospel. Ultimately, number one, the only thing that needs to be is to give the gospel, even in its pure state. It's got to give the gospel. God and the fall, and the consequence of sin, and Jesus as our Redeemer. It's got to be there. So anyway. So Paul presented the gospel within the arguments against their worldviews. Again, the Acts 13 for Jews, Acts 17 for humanists. A community without a church is a mission field. It's the responsibility of believers in existing churches to fill those spiritual voids with believing congregations. We need to ask, I think, whether Paul's strategy is applicable to us today. And I think the answer is yes. It definitely is. It's applicable. I think there's 3 reasons why we can say it is. Number 1, the message is the same. Okay? The message that Paul preached is the same message that we preach. And that's really where the salvation is. What does it say in Romans 1:16? What is the power to salvation? The gospel. So the message has to be the same. You can't water it down. If you water it down, it's not the gospel. And we got to get back to preaching the true gospel. Secondly, is that Paul was a Christian, just like you and I are Christians. And he said, do what I do in terms of following Christ. And he certainly is our example. And so that gives power to the strategy that he used. And thirdly, we're commissioned, and Paul was commissioned. I guess I make the comparison properly. Paul was commissioned, and we are commissioned, right? And with the same commission. See, the end of Matthew 28, and Acts 1:8, it's the same commission that we are Valerie. So, I think that the book of Acts has become very practical for us in terms of a church, and thinking forward that we need to continue to pray to God to give us direction. But I think it's also giving us inspiration and direction and saying, look, I'm going to use you, but I'm going to use you this way. And that we need to become a church that is like the first century church, that goes into an area, presents the gospel, and gathers the people into the church, teaches them and prepares them to be able to go out to other areas. Any questions at all? Any comments?
I guess what my next question would be like, so how do we do that in our community? Because it makes sense, but it's like, so we want to figure out like a strategy, right?
Yeah, we do. And those are things that we're going to have to think about. And you think about it too, because I don't have the time anymore to sit in my office. I gave 1 day a week where all I did was I tried to think about the direction the church is going and what we're going to do, and I don't have that day anymore. So you think about it, and God will help us. But I feel very confident that God is leading us in this direction as a church. Good comment.
And maybe, maybe partly why we haven't found a location yet is because he wants us to learn all the strategy so that when we go in ready to implement what we're going to do and have a task, a goal, and direction what we're going to do, and have our documents, like our tracks, whatever, put together so we're ready to just go in there running. And I mean, I can see drawing working. I keep seeing Hillcrest. I mean, they had that park, and it's right there where the church would be if you right there. And we could have drawing people gather, they ask questions, and if it's all about establishing a church, then I think it needs to be all our church people doing drawing so that afterwards we can say, here's where we meet. Come on Sunday and we will feed you and help you to grow. And using it to help build the church, establish the church. And also going door to door, giving out tracts, or putting even in the mailboxes, because it's hard to find people home at certain times, whatever. Just getting that gospel into their homes so they can read it, but has to have a contact of where our church is to follow them up, so that, okay, you read this and God changes your heart and you're hungry now. This is where you can come to be fed.
Can you even put like a track? I just said that also on the internet.
Yes.
Have it available on the website or something.
And that's the other thing with our culture. People who are hungry and close, like you say, close to the gospel, are looking for, is there somewhere near me, or what, where do I go? And so we have to have that internet presence. We really have to have that.
I actually signed up with an organization that has a gospel presentation, which is the pure gospel, nothing else.
Perfect.
To put on your website.
Yeah.
But again, it ends by directing them back to your website. Here's a church.
Yes.
But our church,
we don't have a place yet. Yeah.
And it makes it difficult.
Yeah.
So we need that.
But can we not be inviting people now? Or-
Sure.
Oh,
or-
certainly, absolutely, yeah, we need to do that too.
Well, okay.
But yeah,
Like, we're not waiting till.
No.
we're
No.
gonna share the,
Okay,
we're not
to go
gonna
down.
wait to share the gospel, of course.
Yeah, no, I just meant
Yeah.
bring them in and it's okay
Absolutely.
with anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
yeah.
So, you know, invite people. I mean, you've got friends and acquaintances and that, and you meet people who will say, like, all you gotta do is ask them, so what church do you go to? And then da-da-da-da. How do you find it? What's the teaching? Don't ask them about their music, ask them about the teaching. See? Are you feeling satisfied with the teaching? Do you have a sense that the path that the church there really cares for your soul and your spiritual growth? That's what they got to film. And I would venture to say, no, I feel really great with the music. It's
We've
not
got awesome music here.
we do. Okay? All right. Jeremy, come and lead us in our last song
And our awesome music.
in our